My name is Alina Carter. I'm 34 from Boston, Massachusetts. I never thought grief could be made worse by betrayal, but I was wrong. When my 10-year-old son passed away, my parents didn't even show up to his funeral. They said weddings were more important than farewells. Weeks later, they came knocking, not with comfort, not with love, but with demands. They wanted the $850,000 trust fund my son left behind for my sister's lavish wedding. That was the moment I decided. I would never forgive, and I would never let them win. Stay with me. This betrayal turned into a war that tore my family apart forever. The day of the funeral was cold, gray, and cruel. I stood in front of the small white casket, my hands trembling, my body numb. My son, Daniel, only 10 years old, had been my light, my heartbeat, my everything. His laughter still echoed in my ears as though the world hadn't yet realized it had stolen him from me. But my parents never came. Not a flower, not a call, not even a whispered apology. Instead, they were busy planning my younger sister's grand wedding at the historic Fairmont Hotel downtown. White orchids, a 6-tier cake, and a string quartet. At first, I thought maybe grief had broken me. Maybe I was overreacting. But then, 1 week later, they arrived at my door. My father, sharp-suited as always, spoke with the same arrogance he had carried my entire life. Alina, you know Daniel's trust is just sitting there. It would mean so much to your sister if you contributed it to her wedding. She deserves a day as perfect as she is. My ears rang. My vision blurred. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My son's money, his inheritance meant for his future, was being treated like a checkbook for champagne toasts and glittering gowns. I looked at my mother, hoping for a flicker of compassion. But she only nodded, adding, "It's what family does, Alina. Your sister's happiness must come first. Don't be selfish." Selfish. That word burned into me. They had skipped my son's funeral, ignored my grief, and now they dared to call me selfish for refusing to fund a party. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. Instead, something colder settled inside me that night. Revenge. If my parents wanted to turn their backs on me and my son's memory, I would show them what real betrayal looked like. Because Daniel's trust fund wasn't just money. It was leverage. And I was about to use it in a way they would never forget. The following days were a blur of anger and disbelief. I could barely process the loss of my son, and now I was being forced to process the cruelty of my own parents. Every phone call from them carried the same poison, guilt trips wrapped in entitlement. "Alina, think of your sister's happiness." My mother's voice dripped with false sweetness one evening. "You can't keep clinging to money that belongs to the family. Daniel would have wanted this." I nearly dropped the phone. Daniel would have wanted this. My son, who cried at weddings because he hated wearing suits. My son, who told me once he wanted to build a shelter for homeless animals with his savings. How dare she use his name like that? The wedding was being planned for September, only 2 months away. My sister, Rebecca, paraded herself on social media in designer gowns, tasting cakes, visiting florists. Every caption read, "Fairy tales do come true." The comments overflowed with admiration. Nobody knew what was happening behind the curtain. Nobody knew that her fairy tale was being built on my son's grave. And that's when it hit me. If they wanted to use Daniel's trust as a weapon against me, I could turn the tables. The trust wasn't just a bank account. It was tied to legal stipulations that I controlled as executor. My parents hadn't realized that. But Rebecca's fiancé, a man named Ethan, certainly didn't know either. One night I sat at my kitchen table, the papers spread before me. Daniel's trust fund wasn't just protected, it was untouchable unless I authorized a transfer. And I had no intention of doing that. Instead, I began to draft a plan, one that would expose my parents' cruelty not only to Rebecca and Ethan, but to every single guest at that picture-perfect wedding. I didn't want quiet revenge. I wanted humiliation. I wanted the same kind of public shattering they had given me when they abandoned Daniel's funeral. So I started writing letters to the venue, to the vendors, to the bank. Quiet, strategic moves that would ensure when the big day came, my parents wouldn't just lose the money, they would lose their carefully polished reputation. The wedding wasn't just going to be ruined. It was going to be remembered for all the wrong reasons. Rebecca's wedding planning went into overdrive, and my parents were the proud architects behind every detail. They flaunted it like a royal event. Invitations embossed in gold ink, a 5-tier cake flown in from New York, a mansion-style venue that dripped with chandeliers and marble staircases. Every Facebook post my mother made screamed, "Look at us, the perfect family." But behind the glitter, I could see the cracks. Ethan, Rebecca's fiancé, seemed uneasy. Whenever I glanced at his Instagram, I noticed subtle things. A strained smile, comments left unanswered, and most tellingly, the absence of Rebecca in his recent photos. It fueled me, because Ethan didn't know the full story yet, and I intended to tell him in a way that would detonate the wedding like a bomb. I reached out discreetly. An email, anonymous at first. A few screenshots attached, legal documents showing that the trust fund was in Daniel's name only, with conditions that locked it permanently. And one photo of Daniel's grave, fresh flowers laid by strangers, because my parents had never visited. "Ask your bride where her family's money is really coming from," I typed, and why she stepped over her nephew's memory to get it. I didn't sign the email, but I knew the truth had teeth. It would gnaw at Ethan until he couldn't ignore it. 2 weeks before the wedding, I got my first sign it was working. Rebecca called me in a frenzy, her voice shaking with anger. "Stay out of my life, Alina. You're not ruining this for me," she screamed. "Ethan and I are solid, you're just jealous." Jealous, the word rang in my head like a cruel joke. I had lost a child, and she thought I envied her floral centerpieces and diamond tiara. It only hardened my resolve. The closer the date crept, the more I refined my plan. I had already warned the vendors that any financial arrangements tied to the trust fund were fraudulent. Quietly, contracts began to fall apart. Rebecca's florist canceled. The caterer demanded full payment up front. I didn't need to destroy the wedding myself. I just needed to plant the truth like poison and watch it spread. The perfect day was turning into a countdown, and I was the only one holding the clock. The morning of Rebecca's wedding was painted in sunshine and champagne. Guests in glittering dresses and tailored suits filled the grand estate, whispering about how perfect everything looked. My parents glided through the crowd with smug smiles, as if they were royalty presenting their beloved daughter to the world. But underneath the lace and luxury, the cracks widened. Ethan hadn't spoken to Rebecca for 2 full days. She brushed it off, pretending it was pre-wedding nerves. But I knew. My email had dug into him, and silence was the scar it left behind. I arrived at the venue alone, wearing a simple black dress. The stairs followed me like shadows. My mother's eyes turned sharp the moment she saw me. "You weren't invited," she hissed, clutching my wrist. I leaned closer, whispering so only she could hear. Neither was Daniel, but unlike you, I didn't forget him. Her face paled, but she quickly forced on a brittle smile for the guests. I walked inside, my heart pounding but steady. This wasn't grief anymore, it was justice. The ceremony began. Rebecca floated down the aisle in a gown worth more than my house, her face glowing with triumph. But Ethan, he looked like a man walking into his own execution. When the priest asked if anyone had objections, silence filled the air. That was my cue. I stood up slowly, the rustle of my dress loud in the hush. All eyes locked on me. "I object," I said, my voice steady. "Not because of love, but because of lies." Gasps rippled through the guests. My parents' faces drained of color. Rebecca froze, clutching her bouquet. I pulled a folder from my bag and held it up. "This wedding is being funded by money that doesn't belong to them. Money meant for my son, Daniel, who they refused to bury with dignity, who they erased for the sake of this spectacle." A shocked murmur swept the crowd. Ethan's eyes widened, fixed on Rebecca. "Is this true?" he demanded, his voice breaking. Rebecca stammered, her mask of perfection crumbling. My parents tried to speak, but the room was already turning against them. I had lit the fuse, and the explosion was only beginning. The silence after my words was heavier than stone. Then came the whispers, rising, swirling, crashing through the hall like a storm. Guests turned in their seats, some covering their mouths in shock, others glaring at my parents as if seeing them for the first time. Rebecca's bouquet slipped from her hands, petals scattering across the aisle like broken dreams. Her face flushed crimson, but no words came out. For once, the sister who had always had a perfect answer for everything stood speechless. Ethan, however, was not silent. He stepped forward, his voice trembling but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Rebecca, did you know your parents tried to steal money from your nephew's trust fund for this wedding?" Rebecca's lips quivered. "It's not like that." "It's exactly like that," I cut in, my voice sharp as glass. "They abandoned Daniel's funeral but came running to raid his savings. Does that sound like love to you, Ethan, or greed dressed in lace?" The room erupted. Guests began to rise from their chairs. A few left immediately, muttering about disgrace. My aunt, always the family gossip, shook her head in disgust and whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "They've always been selfish. Now the world sees it." My parents tried to salvage the wreckage. My father raised his hands, begging for calm. "This is a misunderstanding. Family matters should not be aired in public." But Ethan wasn't listening. He turned to Rebecca, his face hardened with betrayal. "I can't marry into this. I thought I was joining a family built on love. Instead, it's built on lies, money, and cruelty." Rebecca lunged toward him, grabbing his arm. "Ethan, please, don't listen to her. She's jealous. She's always been jealous." But Ethan pulled free, his jaw clenched. "No, Rebecca, she's grieving. You're the one who turned grief into greed." The crowd gasped again, some clapping in quiet approval, others recording on their phones. My parents stood frozen, their reputation dissolving in real time. I felt Daniel's presence with me in that moment, not as a ghost of sorrow, but as a spark of strength. For the first time since his death, I didn't feel powerless. Rebecca collapsed onto the floor, sobbing as Ethan walked out of the hall. And as the doors slammed shut, I knew the final blow was yet to come. The ballroom was chaos, guests whispering, some storming out, others watching like vultures circling a dying beast. Rebecca's sobs echoed against the marble walls, her dress crumpled on the floor like a torn curtain. My parents stood stiff, pale, their empire of lies crumbling right before their eyes. But I wasn't finished, not yet. I walked to the center of the room, holding up the final envelope from my bag. "Since my parents insisted on making this wedding their grandest performance," I said, my voice steady, "it's only fair the audience sees the entire script." Inside the envelope were copies of bank statements and legal documents I had already sent to the press earlier that morning. The local news outlet was notorious for devouring scandals like this. By now, half the city would already be scrolling through headlines about the family who stole from their dead grandson. I laid the papers on the altar for everyone to see. Gasps rippled again as names, dates, and signatures glared back at them. This wasn't hearsay. It was proof. My mother staggered forward, tears streaking her makeup. "Alina, please, don't do this. You're our daughter." I met her eyes, my voice like ice. "You lost the right to call me that the day you skipped Daniel's funeral." The room erupted in applause, not loud, but slow, deliberate, the sound of judgment. A few guests even booed, shaking their heads in disgust. My parents' social throne, built on decades of appearances and charity galas, was collapsing like wet paper. Rebecca's cries turned into screams as she lunged at me, but two guests pulled her back. Her tiara tumbled across the floor, the last piece of her fantasy shattered. Ethan reappeared at the doorway, his voice echoing like a final verdict. "This marriage is over before it began, and so is your mask, Rebecca." He walked away, leaving her wailing in front of hundreds. I turned to leave, my heels clicking against the marble, every step lighter than the last. For the first time in months, I could breathe. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in gold and crimson. I whispered Daniel's name into the wind. "They can't hurt us anymore." And in that moment, I knew my revenge wasn't just complete, it was eternal.